Lucas Mercer had always found comfort in the hum of machines. The constant drone of Omega-9 Station Engineering Bay was a symphony to him, a carefully controlled cacophony of working servos, clanking metal, and the faint hiss of coolant paper dispersing into the air. He had spent the last 8 years of his life keeping the station running, a self-sufficient ecosystem of interconnected circuits and mechanical lifeblood that pulsed through every deck. He preferred machines to people. They were predictable, logical. A quantum drive would never demand unreasonable explanations or erupt in anger over some bureaucratic oversight. It would fail for a reason, and with enough time, Lucas could fix it. People, on the other hand, were another story entirely. He had no patience for politics, no interest in the constant diplomatic maneuvering that took place on the upper levels of Omega-9. The station, floating at the crossroads of several interstellar trade routes, served as a neutral hub for various alien dignitaries and powerful factions, all of whom treated it as a convenient pit stop for refueling, repairs, and clandestine negotiations. Lucas had spent years perfecting the art of staying out of the way, keeping his focus on engines and infrastructure rather than the ever-changing faces of royalty and military leaders who passed through. So when an emergency request came through flagging a priority repair on a foreign vessel, Lucas had groaned inwardly. He was already knee-deep in repairs on a station reactor subsystem, and the last thing he wanted was to drop everything for some overprivileged alien aristocrat who couldn't be bothered to wait their turn. But Omega-9 had rules, and one of them was that high-profile visitors always took priority. He had sighed, shut down his current project, and made his way toward Docking Bay C-12, where the newly arrived vessel awaited his attention. What he found was unlike anything he had expected. The ship was a sleek marvel of alien engineering, its hull shimmering with a pearlescent sheen that subtly shifted colors under the station's artificial lighting. It bore the unmistakable markings of House Lion, one of the most powerful ruling dynasties in the quadrant. Even before stepping aboard, Lucas knew this wasn't just another nobility's transport. This was a royal vessel, and that meant trouble. The ship's quantum drive was supposedly malfunctioning, causing unpredictable energy fluctuations that made it unsafe for further travel. Lucas had expected to meet with an official from the royal delegation, perhaps a senior engineer from their side, to go over the diagnostics with him. Instead, as he stepped aboard, he was immediately met with a towering security detail clad in sleek silver armor, their weapons holstered but hands resting lightly on their energy blades. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Something wasn't right. Then she appeared. Princess Laria of House Leon was unlike any royal figure Lucas had ever seen. Not that he made a habit of interacting with them. Her skin had the soft glow of twilight, a deep violet hue that shifted under the ship's internal lighting. Her hair, long and flowing, shimmered like liquid starlight cascading down her back in silken waves. And then there were her eyes, golden, piercing, and filled with an intensity that made him want to look away and meet her gaze all at once. She moved like someone who was used to commanding attention, her presence almost gravitational, but beneath the regal exterior, something was off. There was an edge to her movements, a tension in her shoulders that suggested she wasn't just irritated, she was barely keeping herself together. Lucas barely had time to open his mouth before she spoke, her voice carrying a sharp authority that brokered no argument. She demanded immediate repairs to her ship's drive, stating that she had urgent business on Centauri Prime and could not afford delays. Lucas had started to explain that station regulations required formal repair requests and priority queue processing, but she had cut him off with an impatient glare that made it clear she was not used to being told no. Then, before the conversation could escalate further, something changed. It was subtle at first, a small tremor in her hand as she reached for a flask of water, a slight stumble in her otherwise precise movements. Lucas noticed the way her breathing hitched, how she blinked rapidly as if trying to steady herself. The shift happened in seconds. One moment she was standing tall, a pillar of authority, and the next she swayed dangerously. The flask slipped from her fingers, shattering against the metallic floor, and she crumpled like a marionette with its strings cut. Lucas's instincts kicked in before his mind could fully process what was happening. He lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. Her body was unnaturally hot against his skin, burning with a fever that had come on too fast to be anything natural. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse erratic beneath his fingertips. The security detail immediately surged forward, weapons raised, but Lucas barely noticed. His focus was on the unconscious princess in his arms. Everything that happened next was a blur. Emergency medical teams were summoned. The ship's security tried to push him aside, but the medical officer overruled them, insisting that he stay as a witness since he had seen the moment she collapsed. They scanned her vitals, ran tests, and then exchanged looks of concern that sent a chill down Lucas's spine. The lead physician, Dr. Emery, frowned at the results, muttering something about an unidentified toxin that was spreading through her system at an alarming rate. Then came the revelation that changed everything. The poison was attacking her genetic structure, binding to her cellular makeup in a way that made conventional antidotes useless. The only known treatment was a bioenergetic transfer, a process that required a compatible donor. Her species had an unusual biological adaptation that allowed for energy exchange through physical contact, a trait that was usually reserved for bonding rituals among their kind. But compatibility was rare. The donor needed to be genetically attuned to her physiology, a match so specific that the odds of finding one outside her own bloodline were astronomically low. The medical team began scanning everyone present, starting with her security detail, but one by one, the results came back negative. Then they scanned Lucas. The moment the scanner passed over him, an alarm went off. The results displayed on the screen were impossible, a 99.9% genetic compatibility, something that should not have been possible for a human. The room fell silent as the weight of the discovery settled over them all. The security detail turned toward him, their eyes unreadable behind their helmets. The medical team exchanged uncertain glances. And then, for the first time since she had collapsed, Laria stirred. Her golden eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking onto him with something dangerously close to horror. She had heard everything. Lucas didn't need to be told what came next. He was the only one who could save her. And to do so, he would have to bond with her in a way that went far beyond a simple medical procedure, a bond that once formed would never be broken. Lucas, who had spent his entire life fixing machines because they were easier than people, had just been unwillingly thrust into the most complicated situation imaginable. And for the first time in his life, he had absolutely no idea how to fix this. Lucas Mercer had always been a man who relied on logic. He solved problems with his hands, with calculations, with the kind of precise mechanical thinking that had kept Omega 9's entire engineering grid running for nearly a decade. But there was no mathematical equation, no system recalibration, no carefully constructed blueprint that could help him process what was happening now. The medical bay was a storm of frantic movement, yet Lucas felt frozen in place. The words hung in the air like a specter he couldn't shake. Permanent genetic bonding. The medical team had confirmed it twice, scanning him over and over, each result flashing the same impossible number. 99.9% compatibility. His human DNA, according to the readouts, contained some unknown factor that made him the only viable match for Princess Laria's bioenergetic transfer. The doctors had tried to explain the science behind it. Laria's species, the Valeri, possessed a unique biological trait, an energy network woven into their cellular structure capable of transferring vitality between compatible individuals. Normally, such a bond only formed between those of their own kind, often during deeply significant ceremonies that tied their lives together permanently. But human DNA wasn't supposed to be capable of such a connection, and yet the evidence was undeniable. Lucas wasn't just compatible, he was the only one who could save her. The realization settled in like a weight in his chest. Dr. Emery, the station's chief medical officer, had spoken with calm professionalism, laying out the situation in precise terms. The bioenergetic link had to be established immediately, or the poison would reach Laria's vital organs. The stronger the physical contact, the faster the transfer, and once the process was started, it could not be undone. Lucas had wanted to argue. He had wanted to protest that this was insane, that there had to be another way. But then his gaze had fallen on Laria, still lying on the medical table. Her normally vibrant violet skin faded to an ashen shade, her golden eyes dimmed with pain. The regal posture she had carried so effortlessly was gone. She was just a person now, a person struggling to stay alive, and Lucas couldn't ignore the truth. She was dying. Laria's security detail had bristled at the idea of a common mechanic, even one with inexplicable compatibility, being the one to bond with their princess. But they had no alternatives. Time was running out. There were no other candidates, no advanced medical treatments that could slow the poison spread. It had to be him. The moment the decision was made, The medical team moved swiftly, guiding Lucas to sit beside her as they adjusted the bioenergetic monitors. The transfer process, they explained, would begin with sustained skin-to-skin contact. The intensity of the bond would depend on the depth of the connection, but once fully formed, it would be irreversible. Lucas swallowed hard as he placed his hand against Laria's, their fingers barely touching. The reaction was immediate. A shock wave of energy coursed through his veins, a sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just warmth or static electricity, it was awareness. His senses blurred and sharpened at the same time, his heartbeat sensing with hers, his breath catching as a surge of foreign emotions flooded through him. He could feel her pain, her fear, her frustration at being so vulnerable, and beneath it all, a strange and terrifying recognition. Laria gasped, her body arching slightly off the medical table as the golden, circuitry-like patterns spread across her skin, glowing brighter with each second. The poison's effect began to slow, then reverse, the darkened veins beneath her skin fading as Lucas's energy flowed into her. It was working, but the connection was not what anyone had expected. The transfer should have been a controlled process, limited, specific. Instead, it was overwhelming. The bond latched onto something deeper than just cellular compatibility. Lucas could feel her thoughts, not as words, but as raw sensations, flashes of memories, instincts, pieces of a life that wasn't his. It was as if an invisible thread had tied them together, their energies weaving into something neither of them had chosen. Lucas clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of the medical table as the intensity built. The golden patterns on Laria's skin pulsed brighter, and for a moment, he swore he could see those same glowing traces appearing on his own arms. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the energy subsided. The room was deathly silent. Lucas pulled his hand back, gasping for breath. He felt different. His entire body tingled with something he couldn't name, like his cells had been rewired, realigned. When he lifted his gaze to meet Laria's, the shock in her golden eyes mirrored his own. She felt it too. The medical monitors beeped in confirmation. The poison had been neutralized, her vitals stabilizing. Relief washed through the room, but it was quickly overshadowed by something else. The process had gone too far. Dr. Emory stared at the readings, a deep frown creasing her face. This wasn't just a transfer. This was a full bonding event. Lucas barely had time to process those words before Laria sat up abruptly, her breathing ragged. She looked at him, and he felt her emotions like a weight pressing against his mind. Disbelief, frustration, and beneath it all, a sharp, undeniable connection neither of them had asked for. Then the pain hit, a sharp, searing pull in his chest, like something inside him was tethered to a force just out of reach. Laria's hand flew to her own chest at the same moment, her face twisting in pain. It was happening already. Dr. Emery's expression turned grim. The bond is stabilizing. The process has anchored itself. If you try to separate now, the neural feedback will cause intense distress, possibly permanent damage. Lucas barely heard her. All he could focus on was the sensation, the awareness of her presence, of her emotions pressing against his own like a second heartbeat he had no control over. It wasn't just shared energy, it was a permanent link. Laria, still regaining her breath, turned toward him, her golden eyes dark with something unreadable. "You feel it," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Lucas did, and for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to fix it. The implications settled over them both like a shadow. The bond was real. It was irrevocable. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was bound to her, to House Lynn, to a fate he hadn't chosen. And somewhere in the depths of that realization, a far more dangerous thought took root. Someone had planned this. The poisoning, the necessity of a bioenergetic transfer, the impossibly perfect compatibility. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone had engineered this outcome. Lucas wasn't just caught in a political mess. He had become the centerpiece of a game bigger than he could see. And if he wanted to survive, he would have to figure out why before it was too late. Lucas had always thought of himself as a practical man. He dealt in machines, circuits, and systems where every problem had a solution, and if something didn't work, it could always be fixed with the right tools. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this, the slow, creeping awareness that his body no longer belonged to him alone. The bond with Laria wasn't just an abstract concept or an invisible tether. It was something real, something that lived beneath his skin like a second heartbeat, something that reacted to her every movement, her every breath. The medical bay had long since emptied, leaving only Lucas, Laria, and the hum of diagnostic equipment still monitoring their vitals. Neither of them spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with an unbearable pressure, a presence that hadn't been there before. Lucas could feel her, not just physically but emotionally, mentally, as though her very existence now pulsed alongside his own. When she shifted on the medical bed, adjusting her posture, a faint echo of her movement ghosted across his own muscles, a subtle pull in the back of his mind that shouldn't have been possible. He felt the way she was trying to compose herself, the way her pulse quickened just slightly when she glanced in his direction, the way her frustration simmered just beneath the surface even though she said nothing. She felt him too. There was no denying it. Her golden eyes flickered to his more often than before, lingering just a fraction too long, as if she were trying to decipher something neither of them understood. Lucas ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. His body still tingled from the transfer, and it wasn't just from exhaustion. The process had left something in him, an imprint, a remnant of her energy still weaving through his own. He wasn't just aware of Laria in a general sense. He was aware of her in ways that should have been impossible. The warmth of her skin, the way her breathing hitched when she was deep in thought, the way her emotions flickered and bled into his own no matter how much she tried to suppress them. It was overwhelming, but it was also inescapable. Dr. Emery had been clear. The bond was stabilizing faster than anyone had anticipated. The more time passed, the more it solidified, knitting them together in ways that defied medical understanding. Lucas had already tested the distance between them, pacing to the far end of the medical bay just to see what would happen. The moment he moved more than 10 meters away, a sharp pull gripped his chest. Not pain, but pressure, an invisible tether yanking him back toward her, like gravity itself had reoriented around her presence. And it wasn't just him. Laria had flinched the moment he'd stepped too far, gripping the edge of the medical bed as though the very act of distance unsettled something deep inside her. She had muttered something under her breath in her native tongue, something sharp and biting, before glaring at him like this was somehow his fault. Lucas didn't know what to tell her, because the truth was he had no answers. The bioenergetic link wasn't just a biological connection. It was something far more intricate than that. He could feel her moods, subtle shifts in her emotions that he hadn't been meant to perceive. When she was angry, his own nerves bristled with irritation that wasn't his. When she was tense, his own muscles coiled with an unease he couldn't place. And worst of all, when her thoughts drifted into dangerous territory, toward frustration or guilt, or something even more unspoken, he felt that too. It was unbearable, and yet it was becoming normal. That was the part that disturbed him the most. Every hour that passed, the bond strengthened. Every moment they spent in each other's presence, it settled deeper into his body, into his mind, until Lucas could no longer tell where his emotions ended and hers began. He clenched his fists, trying to drown out the sensation, but it was relentless. Laria wasn't just in the same room with him. She was inside him. And no matter how much they both wanted to pretend otherwise, neither of them could escape it. Lucas had spent the past few hours testing the limits of their connection. Physical distance caused discomfort, but proximity had its own complications. Whenever they moved too close, the bond reacted, sending strange ripples through his nerves, as if it were encouraging the connection rather than letting them resist it. He hated the way it made him hypersensitive to her presence. He hated the way it made him notice things he shouldn't, the curve of her shoulders, the way her silver hair shimmered under the station lights, the way her lips parted slightly when she was about to say something but changed her mind. None of this should have mattered. She was a princess, and he was a mechanic, a chief engineer, yes, but still a nobody compared to someone of her status. This wasn't real. It was a biological mistake, a malfunction, something that had been forced upon them. And yet the bond didn't care about logic. It thrived on proximity, on connection, on something deeper than either of them wanted to admit. Lucas could feel the same war waging inside Laria. She sat stiffly on the medical bed, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap as though trying to hold herself together through sheer force of will. But he could sense her exhaustion, the way her body longed for rest, but her mind refused to allow it. She hadn't slept since the bond was formed. Neither had he, because the moment one of them started drifting into unconsciousness, the other felt it, an uncomfortable tug at the edges of awareness that made it impossible to fully let go. It was maddening, and it was only getting worse. Lucas knew they couldn't avoid reality much longer. They had to figure out how to function like this. The bond wasn't going to disappear. It wasn't something they could shut down or turn off with a switch. The longer they waited, the more tangled their connection became. And the more tangled it became, the harder it would be to pretend it didn't mean something. Lucas exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. This wasn't just about saving her life anymore. This was about survival. And if they didn't learn how to navigate this together, it would destroy them both. Lucas had spent his entire career working with machinery, systems that followed predictable patterns that could be fixed with logic and skill. But nothing about this situation followed logic. The bond with Laria wasn't something he could dismantle, rewire, or override. It was a living, breathing force, one that neither of them could control. And the more time they spent bound together, the more intense it became. The first real test came when Laria attempted to resume her royal duties. She had insisted on holding a private meeting with her security detail and advisors, determined to maintain some level of control over her rapidly unraveling situation. Lucas had tried to give her space, stepping back into the adjoining quarters to give the illusion of privacy. But the moment he crossed the threshold, a sharp pull wrenched through his chest. It wasn't pain, not exactly, but it was close, like something had latched onto his ribs and tightened, dragging him backward against his will. The sensation sent him stumbling, his vision swimming for a brief second before he instinctively stepped back into the room. And just like that, the discomfort vanished. Laria felt it too. He could see it in the way her fingers clenched on the armrest of her chair, the way her jaw tensed, her skin slightly paler than before. They were too far apart, too far for the bond to remain stable. Her security officers, unaware of what had just transpired, continued their debriefing, but Lucas could feel her frustration, her struggle to keep her emotions in check as she processed the implications of their forced proximity. They couldn't be apart for long, which meant that every aspect of her life, from private strategy meetings to diplomatic negotiations, would now involve him, an outsider, a mechanic, a man who had no place in royal affairs. Laria didn't say a word about it. She didn't need to. Lucas could feel her frustration coursing through their bond like an electric current. And it wasn't just about him. It was about herself. For the first time in her life, she wasn't in control. She had been raised in a world of absolute authority, a world where her decisions were final, where her presence commanded obedience. But this bond had stripped away that certainty. She couldn't control him. She couldn't control how the bond made her react to him, how his emotions boiled into her own no matter how much she tried to suppress them. And the worst part, Lucas could feel her fighting it. She resented how aware she was of him, how every breath he took registered somewhere deep inside her consciousness, how his movements sent phantom sensations rippling through her body in ways that weren't entirely unpleasant. She hated that she had to rely on him. And Lucas hated that he understood exactly how she felt. The next challenge came when she was summoned to a high-level diplomatic briefing. Prince Draven's arrival had thrown the political landscape into chaos, and her advisors were scrambling to salvage the situation. The meeting was meant to determine the official narrative of what had happened, to decide whether the bond should be treated as a scandal or an opportunity. Lucas wasn't supposed to be there, but he had no choice. Neither did Laria. The moment she tried to enter the council chamber without him, the now familiar pull nearly sent both of them to the ground. The sudden, wrenching sensation forced Laria to stagger, gripping the doorway for balance, her breathing uneven. Lucas had felt it too, the sharp, unbearable sense of distance, like someone had physically ripped part of him away. The advisors had stared. The guards had reached for their weapons, misinterpreting the sudden disturbance. And Laria, regal and composed even through her frustration, had straightened, lifted her chin, and simply gestured for Lucas to follow. If anyone had objections, they didn't voice them, because the reality was undeniable now. Lucas was part of this. Not by choice, not by ambition, but because the bond had made it so. The briefing had been tense. Every conversation, every political maneuver had been laced with subtext, with suspicion, with veiled threats. The nobles were divided. Some saw the bond as an opportunity, a chance to solidify an alliance between their people and humanity. Others viewed it as an abomination, a violation of tradition. Prince Draven, still fuming from the bond's existence, had wasted no time in voicing his disgust. He had called it unnatural. He had demanded the bond be broken. And for the first time, Lucas had realized that this wasn't just about him and Laria anymore. This was about power. Because breaking the bond wasn't just a matter of separation. It was a political act, and an impossible one. The bond wasn't something that could be undone through willpower or decree. It was a biological reality, one that even their most advanced medical technology couldn't reverse. Lucas had listened as the nobles debated, as they weighed the risks, as they whispered about alternatives, about whether there were ways to remove him from the equation permanently. And Laria, she had said nothing, not at first. She had let them argue, let them speculate. But Lucas had felt her reaction through the bond. The way her fingers twitched against the table, the way her pulse spiked at the suggestion of eliminating him entirely, the way her emotions hardened, not with agreement but with something far colder. It wasn't until one of the nobles suggested Lucas be confined indefinitely, kept under constant surveillance, treated like a living battery for Laria's energy needs, that she finally spoke. Her words had been measured, her voice a smooth blade. If anyone here believes that I will allow my consort to be treated as anything less than an equal, they are welcome to challenge me. Silence had fallen over the chamber. Lucas had felt the weight of her words, the ripple of power behind them. And for the first time since this ordeal had begun, he had felt something else from her. Not anger, not resentment, not frustration, but resolve. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Laria had made her choice, and so had he. When the meeting ended, when the nobles and guards finally dispersed, Lucas and Laria had stood there in the empty chamber, the weight of the moment still pressing down on them. They hadn't spoken. They hadn't needed to, because in that moment, something between them had shifted. They were still bound against their will. They were still struggling for control, but for the first time, they weren't fighting each other. They were fighting together. Lucas had never been the kind of man to dwell on fate. He preferred things he could control, circuits, mechanical systems that followed predictable rules. But this connection that tied him to Laria was something else entirely. It wasn't just a physical bond, nor was it merely biological. It was something deeper, something he didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. And the more time they spent together, the more impossible it became to ignore. At first, they had fought against it. Laria, ever the regal princess, had tried to maintain her authority, to compartmentalize what was happening, to insist that the bond was temporary, a mere medical necessity that would pass in time. But Lucas could feel her frustration every time he entered a room, could sense the way she wrestled with her own emotions, the way she resisted acknowledging just how much the bond affected her. And yet, despite her resistance, she had begun to adjust to his presence. The first sign had been small, a subtle shift in the way she stood closer to him without thinking, no longer shying away from the connection they shared. Then came the silent understanding, the way they didn't need words to communicate certain things anymore. When tensions rose during political discussions, Lucas could feel the anger simmering beneath Laria's otherwise composed expression before she even voiced it. When Lucas was exhausted from the relentless scrutiny of the court, Laria somehow knew and would subtly steer conversations away from him, as if instinctively protecting him from unnecessary attention. It was an unspoken rhythm, a connection that was no longer just forced upon them, but one they were slowly beginning to navigate together. But the outside world was far less forgiving. Tensions continued to escalate between Laria's people and Prince Draven's faction. The political maelstrom that had started with her poisoning was growing more volatile by the day. Whispers of conspiracy filled the halls of the royal palace. Theories spread like wildfire, some claiming the bond was a scandal meant to weaken Laria's position, others arguing that Lucas had been planted as a political tool to force an alliance with humanity. And then there were those who simply wanted him gone. The first attack had been subtle, an engine malfunction on one of the royal transports, a failure that, upon closer inspection, had been sabotage. The second was less subtle, a security breach in Lucas' living quarters, an intruder who had somehow bypassed palace defenses and left behind a warning. A single blade embedded in the wall next to his bed. The message was clear. But the third attempt was deadly. They had been traveling to a diplomatic summit when the shuttle controls failed mid-flight. Lucas, who had spent his entire career fixing machines, had felt the failure the moment it happened. The unnatural jerk of the vessel, the sudden loss of stabilizers, the flickering of emergency systems that should have been foolproof. Instinct had kicked in immediately. While the pilot panicked, Lucas had lunged toward the control panel, bypassing standard procedures and forcing a manual override. The shuttle's descent was anything but smooth, the emergency thrusters barely stabilizing their trajectory before they crashed into the surface of a barren outpost moon. The impact had been enough to rattle every bone in his body. By the time the dust settled, Lucas had barely managed to pull himself from the wreckage when he felt a wave of panic surge through his chest. Except it wasn't his own. Laria. She had been thrown forward upon impact, her seat safety harness failing to fully engage. He had found her slumped against the cracked interior wall of the shuttle, her normally pristine royal garments torn, her breathing shallow. And for the first time since their bond had formed, Lucas had felt everything she felt, not just fear, not just pain, but relief. Relief that he was still alive, that the bond hadn't been severed in the crash. That realization had shaken him more than anything else. It meant that despite her protests, despite her insistence that their connection was nothing more than an inconvenience, some part of her had begun to accept it. Some part of her had started to rely on it just as much as he had. When she finally regained consciousness, there had been no command, no sharp words meant to reassert her authority. There had only been her hand reaching for his in the dim light of the ruined shuttle, and for the first time, Lucas hadn't hesitated to take it. But their enemies had no intention of letting them recover. The crash had been no accident. Whoever was behind the sabotage had known exactly where they would be, had planned the attack with surgical precision. And before Lucas could even attempt to repair the damaged communications relay, they were found. Armed figures emerged from the rocky terrain, their weapons trained on them in perfect formation. They weren't random mercenaries. They were soldiers, trained, precise, efficient. And worse, they were wearing the insignia of Draven's faction. This wasn't just an attack. This was a message, a declaration that Lucas had become more than just an inconvenience. He was now an obstacle that needed to be removed. Laria, despite her injuries, had immediately tried to take control of the situation, falling back into the role of a diplomat. But it was futile. The lead soldier, a man with the unmistakable bearing of a loyalist to Draven, had simply raised his weapon and fired. Lucas had moved before he even thought about it. His instincts, honed from years of working in hazardous conditions, from surviving more mechanical disasters than he could count, took over. He had tackled Laria to the ground just as a shot blasted past them, scorching the interior wall of the wrecked shuttle. And just like that, everything changed, because the moment Lucas had thrown himself in front of that shot, the moment he had protected her without thinking, something within their bond shifted. He felt it, a surge of raw, unfiltered energy, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the usual emotional bleed-through, it was power. Laria's power. And it was flowing through him. The realization hit him like a shockwave. Their bond wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about proximity. It was evolving. And whatever was happening between them, whatever new force had awakened as a result of their connection, it was something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Because for the first time in history, a human had just accessed the latent abilities of a royal bloodline. And from the look of horror on Laria's face as she stared at him, she knew exactly what that meant. Lucas wasn't just her bondmate anymore. He was now something else entirely, something the galaxy had never seen before. And if Draven's soldiers had been sent to kill him before, now they would be coming for him with everything they had. The air around them was thick with the scent of scorched metal and ionized particles, remnants of the failed assassination attempt that had left them stranded in the barren wastelands of the outpost moon. The attackers had been driven back, but not before they had seen what had happened, not before they had realized that something impossible had taken place between Lucas and Laria. Lucas could still feel it coursing through his body, that power, the raw energy that had surged through him in the heat of battle, something that had never belonged to him before. It had been Laria's power, the latent ability of her royal bloodline, something that should have been impossible for a human to access. But when he had protected her, when he had thrown himself into the fight without hesitation, the bond between them had shifted, and now he could feel it pulsing beneath his skin. Laria, still weak from the poison and the energy transfer, had barely been able to stand when the dust settled. But her golden eyes had been locked onto him, wide with disbelief, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just witnessed. No human had ever accessed the abilities of the royal bloodline. It wasn't just unprecedented, it was dangerous. They had known from the beginning that their bond was more than just an inconvenient entanglement. But now it was something that could change everything. And the moment Draven's forces had realized what had happened, the moment they had seen Lucas,